ahead and get started. So welcome to today's SERI webinar, MoVE It, Modeling Viable Electronic Information Transfers with Nick Canizzo. My name is Morgan Jones-King. I'm the South Carolina Department of Archives and History Electronic Records Archivist. I work in the digital and imaging section of the archives. We do have upcoming SERI webinars. The next one in September features new resources for digital records, records that came out of the CoSA grant to gather and develop and share best practices and guidance materials to improve the creation, management, preservation, and use of permanent state government digital records and information. The webinar will review some of the documents, guidelines, and resources produced throughout the grant. There is also a link to those documents if you're interested on the SERI webpage for upcoming webinars, and there will be further webinars this fall. Please do let us know during the webinar or after the webinar if there are topics that you are interested in us covering in the future. There are SERI online recordings that you can avail yourself of. Managing digital content over time are modular videos designed for people who are new to digital preservation or people who are new to your agency to learn about how to identify, select, store, protect, manage, and provide access to digital content over time. Those recordings are available at the link on this page through the Utah State Archives. We also have a short video on YouTube, FAQs on bit rot, so a very short, non-technical overview of data degradation built by SERI, and it is useful to electronic records archivists, digital archivists, but also to records managers, and useful in helping us explain to records managers or records creators the dangers of data degradation. There will be more videos coming soon. Thank you. Becky just posted the link to the upcoming webinars in the chat box, so feel free to click on that and learn a little bit more about those. All right, I am not going to hang us up too terribly long. I know that we want to leave plenty of time for questions. So today's presenter is Nick Canizzo. If you have been watching SERI webinars, you will know he is an old hat at this, and we're grateful to him for being willing to present for us so many times. Nick Canizzo has been a digital archivist for the past decade. He worked at George Washington University and at the state of Vermont, and now he is a consulting archivist. And he today is going to talk about the MoVE It project, a joint research venture between CoSA, Preservica, and AVP Inc. So I will not take up too much time with the summary, and I will just go ahead and turn it over to Nick.
Great, thank you. Actually, I have control, so let's move right in. Yes, I'm Nick Canizzo. I'm the project manager for the MoVE It project for the Council of State Archivists. I see a number of familiar names in the attendee list. Some folks are very intimately involved with this project, so I hope I do you all justice. So today we're just going to be talking about kind of the background for how this project got started, really where it came from. We'll talk about the methodology, what we're doing to actually kind of collect data and synthesize it into some useful tools and templates and things. I'll go over very briefly the membership and the projects that we've selected. We'll talk about the goals of the project, and of course, the final report and the deliverables. We'll talk about what some of the plans are for those. Those are not expected for a few more months, but you're all desperately waiting in anticipation. And then hopefully there will be time for questions and answers at the end, though I know I'm going to wow you all so much that there will be no questions. So the MoVE It project, modeling viable electronic information transfers. It's a pretty straightforward project. The goal here for all of us is to understand better how the states, territories, and districts of Columbia are really doing electronic records transfers, mostly from kind of the creating public agencies or their original records custodians to the designated archival repositories. Why are we doing this? Well, let's talk about some background. So I want to talk about two studies, 2 reports that CoSA produced in the last few years that kind of underscore, and hopefully I'll do a good job convincing you of something that you probably already know, which is there's a lot of risk here when it comes to kind of the preservation of permanent electronic records in government. Every few years, Council of State Archivists and the State Electronic Records Initiative essentially does a survey to all the states and territories, asking about a whole bunch of different aspects of how they do their digital preservation programs, electronic records management, so on and so forth, staffing, funding, resources, etc. The 2017 report, this was a few years ago, there's a couple of key, there's a lot in this report. It's going to be linked at the end. So, if you haven't read it, I really recommend going back through and reading these reports. It really shows a kind of a good cross-section over time of how the kind of national, writ large process, or really kind of how states in general are performing electronic records transfers and electronic records management. They're really useful resources, but I wanted to highlight the 2017 one most because a lot of the genesis for this project comes from there. And there's a couple of key factors from it. One is that there's exponential growth in born digital records, nearly 1,700% since kind of in the 10 years prior. That shouldn't be news to anyone on this call. If you're working in and around digital information management, electronic records management, digital preservation, you know that there are more electronic records being created today probably than ever before. And we're probably at a point where the volume of electronic records being created, and I'm talking about ones that will be designated for permanent preservation, is probably greater than multiple years prior. So it is expanding rapidly. However, knowing this, we also know that a lot of our statutes, regulations, record retention schedules, those type of regulations that govern the retention of these records, many of them are outdated. And this is true kind of across the United States because many of them have been written, were written in the 20th century, didn't really conceive of a really fully digital process. And frankly, many of them should be updated, and a lot of them, even since this 2017 report, have been. In addition to that, there's manual transfer protocols for records. Many states, and I'm going to say states, but really I just know that I'm talking about the territories and District of Columbia as well. To all my friends in the territories in DC, you're not forgotten. It's just I didn't say it 100 times. So for all of the states, or many of the states, we know that a lot of the transfer procedures and the tools that are used for actually transferring both the physical and intellectual custody of records are manual. They're kind of ad hoc. Some of us would not be surprised to know that there are, some of us are still finding CDs and flash drives and old hard drives and probably even floppy disks in Hollinger boxes, right? We know that these transfer procedures are really not adequate for what we know now about what is necessary to preserve electronic records. So that's a big problem as well. And lastly, and this is not really of the same order of magnitude, but there's really rising expectations for the use and access to electronic records. It's no longer, and I'm not saying it ever was fully adequate, but there's a lot more knowledge, both for our designated communities, but also our stakeholders, that we want to have access to actual original, born digital records. So in order to do that, there's a whole host of requirements and a whole bunch of boxes we need to check in order to make sure that happens. And it's no longer fully acceptable to be able to be given kind of low quality scans or things that are printed out, were born digital, printed out, rescanned, put into a digital repository. Those type of things are lackluster at best, and they really are kind of betray a kind of an old standard of practice. So in addition, that 2017 study led to towards a common understanding, which was kind of a joint venture research partnership between CoSA and Preservica, one of our sponsors, with NASIO, the National Association of Chief Information Officers, who was a partner on it as well. And I think the title of this report really says it all, which is we really want to make sure that all of our stakeholders have a shared common understanding about what the expectations are not only for the preservation of electronic records, but also the transfer, and that physical and intellectual custody transfer that I'm talking about. So this report kind of was the really synthesized two surveys that were done. There was a pre-survey kind of before the main survey that went out to state and territorial archives, and then the main bulk survey went out to archives, public agencies, and IT agencies throughout the United States. Now, why that is important is because this was the CoSA contacting public agencies. These are the records creators. These are the records custodians themselves, and asking them a bunch of questions. So there were a lot of good responses. 27 agencies from 27 states and territories responded, so there was some good national coverage. And there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight from this report that kind of set the stage for the MoVE project as well. And the first one is something that will probably not come as a surprise to many of you, but 60% of public agencies who responded said either that they had no digital permanent records, or they didn't know if they did. And we know that while that number is truthfully reported, we know that they're wrong. For lack of a better term, we know that pretty much every public agency in the United States right now, I'm willing to make a wager on that one, is using computer technology to create electronic records, and most of the time they're high-level administrative records, things like that they are born digital electronic records. We know that they are probably designated for permanent preservation by statute, regulation, record schedule, etc. So we know that they're probably wrong. But the question is, why? Why are they reporting this? Why do they have this lack of understanding? So we'll get to that. Secondly, it's not just that public agencies don't necessarily know if they do have permanent electronic records. So we've already lost 60% of the public agencies. 42% of the ones that reported essentially said, additionally, even if I did have them, or despite the fact that I have them, I don't know what the requirements are for me to transfer those records to my designated archives. And part and parcel to that is the result is that very few of these transfers, the ones that did happen, very few of them were scheduled. Very few were automated. Most of them were manual, kind of like we discussed before. And in addition to all of this, there's kind of the long-term and the long-range planning aspect to all of it, which is that a significant number of our respondents had no plan to transfer records, and that's a great risk for us as well. As data becomes cheaper, as cloud storage becomes cheaper, many public agencies are opting just to hold on to stuff for longer and longer periods of time because it's onerous, or it is kind of this situation where they don't know how onerous it will be to actually extract those records from their system of record and transfer them to their designated archives. So putting it all together, I'm going to paint a pretty bleak picture. There's huge increase in the volume of records. Those records are housed in systems which, I'll be charitable and say they have dubious digital preservation mechanisms. Truthfully, most of the systems that we know that public agencies are using, your Office 365, content management systems, databases, websites, things like that, they have no digital preservation mechanisms. Some of them do, and for many states they're not implemented. So we know that digital preservation in place is not really there yet. So huge amount of records, digital preservation not really happening. Agencies don't really know whether they have permanent records or not. Even if they do, they're not necessarily sure how to transfer them. The archives themselves report need to update their own transfer protocols, but they might not necessarily have a good relationship or a good understanding of their IT infrastructure, or frankly, no IT support to be able to promulgate and kind of update those standards. So that's where the MoVE project comes in. The whole goal of this project is to demonstrate kind of with a proof of concept, and I'll get to the methodology of it, but we're essentially trying to demonstrate how a select set of permanent records can be identified, and that identification process really could happen over a long period of time. We're not just talking about understanding what your retention requirements are, but actually being able to apply those to your records, actually being able to say this record and the associated information about the record, so the metadata about this record, this needs to be preserved. How do we actually identify those? Then there is the process of, well, now that we've identified, how do we get them ready for transfer to the archives? There are, there's going to be a bunch of procedures that are going to need to, be in place in order to get it from point A to point B. And then lastly, we're actually talking about the, executing the mechanism of transfer, getting it to the archives. So that's really the scope of this project. We're not really investigating what happens to records once the archives has taken custody of them. So there's no kind of digital processing or long-term digital preservation. It's really how does it make it from the agency to the archives. And that's important, and that's a big enough bite right there because there's a lot that goes into it. One of the things that I really like is looking at kind of international standards. So ISO 20652, kind of outlines a lot of these requirements. What I've thrown up on the screen is, the slide I borrowed from a previous presentation on this topic. Essentially, when you're looking at some of these requirements, there's a lot that goes into what a transfer actually is, right? It's not just, select a bunch of records in Windows Explorer, drag them from one folder into the next, and, give the hard drive to somebody else. I mean, that is it at its basest procedure, but there's a lot of intellectual kind of information and procedural management that goes along with it. So I'm not going to read out all of these different things, but I really recommend you look at the ISO standard if you want to learn more about kind of all the things that can go into a transfer. But just for argument's sake, we're going to be talking about we're going to be talking a lot about how to model these transfers. So we're going to need a framework to use. And this is a good place for us to start. And this is probably one of, we're eventually going to kind of develop our own because there's a lot more that goes into managing kind of the public aspect of this because there are freedom of information requirements or records exemption requirements or statutory requirements, personal health information, HIPAA, et cetera. There's a lot that goes into it. You can't just discard all those additional requirements. However, we're really trying to distill this down to the basic foundational elements that make a transfer because that will help us create some tools that are more universal because we know that every state is different, every territory is different, et cetera. So to speak broadly of the goals of this project, we would like to, or we plan to, talk about and establish really roles, methods, and benefits that the three major stakeholder groups we're talking about when we're talking about an electronic records transfer. Talking about the records creator, the records custodian, so that's the public agency in this case. Talking about the archives, the designated archive repository, and then kind of in between there as a support agency is IT. And that might be agency IT, it might be archives IT, it might be a statewide IT department. And we know that there are other stakeholders, and we know there's others that are involved in this process, but these are kind of the major stakeholder groups that are going to be involved in every one of these in some way or another. But we want to facilitate dialogue and collaboration with our stakeholder partner organizations, vendors. That's really important, and you're going to see that as a through line through both my presentation and the project itself, is that collaboration, cooperation, communication, they are essential to making a transfer successful. When you think about the IT agency's involvement, it's not just do they provide the technology to make the transfer happen. IT involvement starts possibly decades before that when the state or the public agency is selecting a piece of software for use as part of their business process. Because if your software stores or creates data, which they all do, that's going to impact how your transfer process actually can work. Because records need to be selected, they need to be identified, they need to be prepared or extracted. Eventually, they need to be transferred, and where they are at the beginning of this process matters. How they are created in these systems matters. So it's not just when the retention has been met and it's time to transfer the records, does everybody get involved? Really, the process starts a long time before that, so we don't want to lose sight of that. So we want to facilitate that dialogue. And then we included vendors in here as well because let's be realistic. For most states and federal government, they're not developing their own software. They're not building out their own technology infrastructure. They're using vendors, whether they're kind of cloud storage or content management or collaboration software or whatever it is. There are relationships with vendors, and one of the things we will talk about in this project is whose responsibility is it to work with and manage vendors, because everybody on this call probably has dealt with a situation in which there was data in a vendor solution that was difficult to extract because it was in a proprietary format, or it was in they wanted a lot of money to get it out, or didn't conform to requirements that the state had or the archives had. So there's a lot of potential pitfalls there. So we need to have them be part of the conversation as well. And then lastly, the kind of one of the major goals is to pilot an electronic records transfer use case template, which that's kind of a big jumble of words, but essentially what we're saying is, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. However, we do believe that there are some universal factors. Whether we're talking about success factors here, but we're also talking about the factors that make a transfer possible. And we kind of talked about those in the last slide. The requirements in that producer archive transfer requirement slide. We're talking about what is truly universal about transferring physical and intellectual custody that we can extract from these projects. So I'm going to take a drink of water for a second, and then I will talk about the methodology. So our methodology is, I think, pretty straightforward, and I'm going to get into kind of do a deep dive on each one of these, but I'm just going to go over this quickly. Essentially, our plan is to, or was, I guess it's in flight, so it's ongoing, is to convene a focus group of expert digital archivists from around the U.S. We wanted to make sure that we had a diversity of not only thought, but also a diversity of experience. We know that every state is different, and territory is different in terms of resources. And when I say resources, I mean staff time, actual funding, IT support, and/or technological resources, experience, and knowledge. And those are kind of the major resources that we're talking about. We know that everyone's in a different position. That's okay. That's not a problem. If we believe that there are some kind of universal requirements and universal factors that make these things successful, I think that transcends any differences that we have, and that's kind of the goal. What CoSA and SERI have. So after we convene that group, we solicit, select, and study highly successful electronic records transfers. I'll talk about what the criteria are for those in a few slides, but essentially our goal is to say the best of the best. We were never looking for perfection. We know that there is no such thing as a perfect transfer, but we're just looking for which transfers recently over the last few years essentially went well. And like I said, it doesn't mean flawless, it just means which ones were successful, where records got from point A to point B without much loss or damage, or relationships being damaged or anything like that. Then we will develop and utilize this electronic records transfer use case template, right, for data collection analysis. So that's all been done, sneak preview, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Then we move into an analysis phase where we're kind of determining the success factors. What are those universal factors that we can say these are the things that every transfer process really needs to have or needs to be thinking about in order to be successful or to maximize their success. And then lastly is to take those success factors and distill them into some tools that states, territories, and honestly anyone else can use to implement, or honestly more likely is to adapt to their own unique situation to improve. That's the whole goal of this entire project, a rising tide lifts all boats. So in this particular project, what we want to do is just raise the overall competence of everybody. And we can learn a lot from our successes. Now, we've learned a lot from our failures too. We might talk a little bit about that later. So convening the focus group was kind of the first step. So we we kind of reached out in a two-pronged way. Barbara, the CoSA executive director, reached out to each of the, to all the states and territories in DC right around COVID time. So thankfully everyone was still available, and even with all the upheaval and people working from home and not having access to their computers and their work resources at work. So I wanted to talk about the focus group in a second, but everyone has been super flexible and really, really great on that aspect. We were announcing the project and looking for volunteers, so we solicited that way. And then I reached out to a bunch of individual digital archivists, just that I had worked with or had I'd seen presentations about their work and their transfers. People who I knew were working on this type of thing to try to put this group together. So we really got 3 types of responses back from this. And I think that this was the first kind of part of the data collection, was just really to see how, kind of the nation responded to this. And we either got folks saying, yes, we want to be part of this project. We have some projects in mind, and there's someone we're gonna say, if you want to have them be part of the focus group, contact events. They designated either archivist and some projects. Some states said that they only, they didn't really necessarily think they had any highly successful projects that they wanted to profile, but they did want to be part of the focus group. And then many, a few responded to saying we don't really have either. We don't really have someone who can devote the time to this, or we don't really have a project that we think would be a good candidate for this. But we're interested. We're interested in supporting and interested to see where this goes. So we've got a very healthy response. So I appreciate everyone. If you're on this call and you're part of the focus group, or you were contacted by us, thanks for all your help so far. We'll still be kind of calling on you a little more, but yeah. So anyway, the focus group once it was once we got our responses, we were really looking for a group of about 10, 12 members. We didn't want it to be too big and unwieldy, but we also wanted to make sure that we were able to get that diversity of experience and thought that we were talking about. And really, from a volunteer perspective, we didn't want to overtax people, especially in kind of these times where there's a lot of uncertainty. So really, we're looking for about 8 to 10 hours total of participation over kind of the summer, fall. And we're kind of well into that. And that was completed around probably the end of May, beginning of June. That's kind of when we got our membership crystallized, which you can see it here. I don't really have anything to say about about the membership. I'm really happy with the work that we've done so far. I'm really happy working with everybody. It's a super collaborative group. One of the things that we're going to talk about in our final report are kind of the perspectives of not just these projects, but the folks who are working on them, the folks who are looking back on them as well, because there's a lot of lessons to be learned, both with our successes and our failures. So one thing I will say is that I think that the focus group and all the work that we've done has been very successful so far, and I have this group of folks to thank for that. So if you are on this call, or one of these folks is sitting next to you, for me, and I thank you myself. So moving on to the projects part of this, we were looking for highly successful projects, but intentionally, we chose to have a liberal criteria for that. I didn't want to prejudice the data collection aspect of this by saying, there had to be no data loss, or it had to be flawless, or it had to be scheduled, or it had to be automated, or anything like that. We really wanted to get a natural kind of understanding of what was going on out there. So really what we asked the focus group members was to select a bunch of projects that they or their archives thought were successful, what they considered to be successful. And then the idea would be once we had our selection of exemplars, then we would try to learn what exactly made those successful. I think it makes sense, but the other thing that we preferred was that we wanted projects that were not really studied super extensively. This doesn't mean that we're looking for only new projects. Obviously, some of these projects have probably been talked about before, or certainly have been talked about before, and that's good. They're good projects, so we want to hear about them. We want to elevate and talk about these projects more. But the other thing that's really important for us is that we're still moving the conversation forward. We're not. it's not to say that a transfer that took place in 1995 is not relevant to today, but it's a lot of it is not relevant anymore. So we're trying to look for some recency and some success. But really, the most important factors that we have that we are trying to get, again, we're talking about diversity again. We're trying to get diversity was different types of records, different types of agencies, and different systems of origin. And those are all, those are kind of what we kind of thought would be most instructive in terms of the way that we could collect the data. We wanted to make sure that there was no bias because we're talking about all, governor's records. We wanted to make sure there's no bias because we're only talking about unstructured data. We wanted to make sure there was no bias because we didn't, we're not talking about records coming out of a content management system. We're only dealing with records that are sitting on a shared drive. We wanted to make sure that, we could analyze projects that dealt with a lot of the complications and a lot of the different vagaries of how transfers actually happen, because we all know ahead of time that no plan survives contact with the enemy. So we know that no transfer process or no transfer procedure is ever going to be 100% perfect, and there'll be no exceptions and so on and so forth. So we know that there will be weird situations and corner cases and things like that that we have to deal with. So how can we account for those? Well, we said, well, let's think about all of them right now. Let's get this diversity of projects as much as we can to make sure that there aren't any weird corner cases that don't really fit. So here's a really brief list of the really kind of boiled down to what the exemplar projects are. So we have a good coverage of different types of records. We have a good coverage of different types of agencies. So we've got some governors, we've got some from the judiciary, a couple of executive branch agencies, and then we have all different types of systems really all over the place, email, databases, unstructured document, GIS data, proprietary vendor systems, homegrown systems. There's really everything in here, some of which were really easy to deal with, some of which were challenges to deal with. And the challenges are as important as the stuff that was easy. So what you're going to see when the report is finished and kind of at the end of this project is not just kind of the data collection for each of these projects, but really kind of a brief narrative about what these projects are, what the records that we're talking about, when the project started, kind of how it developed, and when it was concluded, if it has concluded. Some of these are actually still ongoing; they're still regular, and that was another thing we tried to focus on as well, was to have things that had ongoing kind of regular transfers and also kind of one-time or ad hoc transfers. So in order to find these projects, there was a selection process, and I said what the criteria for those were. Once we selected them, I conducted in-depth interviews with the individual archivists. These interviews took place in a single session, but it was a really collaborative process. We had a template of questions, and those questions really covered kind of the major areas of the transfer process. So we talked about kind of foundations, what existing legal and procedural frameworks, regulations, statutes, et cetera, were in place that influenced and governed a lot of the both physical and intellectual control of these records. The initiation phase, so when it was determined by whom it was determined that it was time to transfer records, how that process got started, who initiated it. And then we talked about preparation, packaging. This was getting the records ready, whether it's extracting them, reformatting them, finding them, whatever it was. We talked about that aspect, then actually talked about what kind of the mechanisms in which we executed the transfers, any verification process that was taken at the archives. This is not kind of traditional digital processing. This is more, did the stuff that the agency intended to send us actually arrive, and was it undamaged, and was it complete, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, there was a closeout process, any legal custody transfer, any things that needed to be signed off on, to say the process was complete. So once that process was considered to be complete, that was kind of the end of the scope of what we were looking at. But like I said, this has kind of been an ongoing kind of collaborative process. Like I said, I did the interviews, but I went back and forth clarifying through emails with some of the focus group members, and I can't again thank the focus group enough for continuing to work on this with me. It's really hard to talk about everything that goes into a single transfer, considering you're talking about a lot of background information. You're talking about potentially decades of legal foundations of kind of collaborative process leading up to an actual transfer. Like I said, when electronic records get transferred, it's not like a light bulb goes off, somebody throws records onto a hard drive and then it moves. It's really this continual process that starts decades before. So it's hard to cover all of that in a single interview or in a short period of time. So we went back and forth to clarify. And I think we've come up with and gathered a huge amount of data about really every aspect of these transfers. So the output from this data that we've collected is going to be a couple of things. I do have a typo here. Excuse me for that. One is the electronic records transfer template. This is kind of what I've kind of talked about a couple times before. This is just anatomy and analysis of these different exemplar projects, and the goal is to be able to have a template that can be used or adapted by really anyone who wants it to be able to say, okay, well, are you asking all of these questions? Do you have the answers to all these questions at hand? And if you don't, you probably need them, right, in order to actually successfully execute this transfer. And the goal is not to say that people don't know what they're doing, because everybody does. Putting it into a framework that is consistent and coherent that we can very easily refer to and help us organize our work. But that is a big part of this. And then, of course, the individual narratives for the specific projects. Then there is the collection and collation of supporting materials. So the narratives and the templates themselves, that's not the only data that we're collecting. I've done research on state statute, state regulation, record schedules. The focus group members have shared supporting materials on policy and procedure, background information on how projects, some of the projects required some external funding, so there's some background information on that. We tried to collect as much information that was available about these projects as possible, because my hope is to really leave no stone unturned when it comes to making sure that we analyze these completely. So yeah, we kind of completed this process at the end of July and early August. So out of the next phase, which is really just getting started, is the analysis process. And I can share some of the results of the analysis. I'm pretty much the only person so far who's actually been and kind of looked at all of these projects. And one thing I can say is that, boy, there really was not a lot that was similar among any of the projects, which is really great. Everybody had kind of a different legal foundation, a different kind of retention policies, transfer procedures, different organizational structure, different location within state government, different IT support, different levels of IT support. Some states have state IT agencies, others have archives, IT departments in their state archives, others have neither of those things and they're dealing with an agency IT. There's all different types of technologies involved. All the transfer mechanisms were pretty much all very different. Who did the packaging, who did the initiation, all of that was different. And that's great because we wanted that kind of diversity. It would have been, as a little tangent, it would have been really sad if everyone was like, oh yeah, we just use this software and this thing. That doesn't exist. And maybe someday down the road, the standard archival technology will exist for conducting these types of transfers, but it doesn't yet. And so we're left trying to piece it together and come up with these processes ourselves. That's why we're having this project. But other things that I can say about the project so far is that one major thing that has come up is less so funding, though funding has been part of it. More so, it's resources. How much resource? Okay, just going to skip trying to say that. How much effort do the various stakeholders and how much can they bring to bear in making this project move forward? A transfer project. So we're talking about how much staff time the agency is willing to provide, how much money, how much experience do they have in doing this type of stuff. And the same thing is true with IT, and the same thing is true with the state archives. I think in one way or another, pretty much every one of the projects hinged greatly on, everyone really having the same goal and being able to participate equally in it. There was no one kind of being dragged along with these projects. That kind of leads into my next point, which is, these projects were not done in a vacuum. We talk mostly about the records custodian, i.e. the public agency, the IT department, and the archives, but there's others that are involved as well. And there's many, 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 many more opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. Pretty much every one of the Exemplar projects hinged on successful collaborations, whether they were kind of ongoing ones, relationships that had lasted, had been ongoing for decades and lasted a long time, or ones that were new, ones that were started by the agency reaching out to the archives or the archives reaching out to the agency. So collaboration was hugely important, and we'll be talking about that a lot in our report. Generally, the opportunities for technological platforms to help, even in our best exemplars. I think I don't want to put words in the focus group member's mouth, but we might say that some of our transfers were a little bit low tech. It really was a handoff of a hard drive from one person to another. Sometimes that was attended by actual security procedure. Sometimes that was attended by legal documents saying, okay, I'm signing this over to you now, chain of custody type situations. And other times it wasn't. And it really, the truth is that one thing that I heard a number of times was that everybody wants a platform that is easier. Everyone wants a process that is simple because, again, moving back to our first point, it's government. We're not exactly overflowing with resources. We're not exactly overflowing with time, and we're not exactly overflowing with kind of the willingness to expend those on something like digital preservation, which really deals with records that have have more historical and permanent administrative value rather than what's happening right now. And especially since the coronavirus crisis might highlight that as well. But the one last thing I wanted to say about all of this is that really the thing that I would underscore and that many of the focus group members said was that kind of working out a process that worked for all the stakeholders was more important than any individual product, any individual platform, any individual technology that was used. I always say, and if you've seen one of my presentations before, technologies come and go, but it is a thorough understanding of what the process needs to be and what those universal requirements are that make these transfers successful. So, I kind of talked about some of this already, but really the success factors are having a good foundational knowledge. This is really understanding the record set, and this is not just from the archives perspective, it's from the agency as well. It's going to be really hard for an agency to transfer permanent records if like 60% of them from one of the first slides, they don't know that they even have them. It's going to be a big ask. Secondly is collaboration. That's how you kind of solve those gaps in knowledge, is by developing great relationships with records custodians and records creators, educating them, making it, kind of speaking their language, understanding why it's important for them to understand their requirements. Having solid technical support is really key as well. That is going to come in a bunch of different forms. Sometimes the best technical support and sometimes the technical support that some of our Exemplar projects got was mostly just IT staying out of the way, or IT just kind of provided the software, hardware, and walked away. Other times they were right there kind of performing the transfers themselves. So that can work in a number of different ways. But again, we go back to kind of the previous bullet point, which is just have a collaborative process, have one where all the expectations are the same. Everybody knows what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. If that's all true, it kind of doesn't matter who's doing it, assuming the applicable state laws and federal laws and regulations are followed. But if you have all of those, who's doing it is kind of less important. And then lastly, time is a factor as well. We know that a lot of times transfers are initiated because eek, my server's full, or eek, the roof collapsed, or the basement flooded, or we're doing a technology refresh. So it's hard to have a successful transfer when you're under the gun and you have a timetable. I think the exemplars with the governors are really great examples of these, because most of our elected officials, some of them know that they're not going to be running and they're not going to be in office the following term, but many of them don't know until maybe half a year or a few months before they're leaving, and then it's a mad dash and kind of a scramble to make these transfers happen. Like I said many times throughout this presentation, this kind of collaboration, it requires time, and it requires a broad view of time, especially when we're talking about technology, these electronic records management systems, content management systems, which get set up and decisions get made years or decades before the actual timing of the transfer. So, time is a factor in all this, and how much time we can all devote to these projects, that really matters. So, all of this will be summarized and will be expanded upon greatly in the final report. It's going to be planned for it'll probably go out probably the beginning of next year. Obviously, we'll talk about the background, problem statement, methodology, membership, work summary, exemplar projects, analysis, conclusions. So that's all going to be part of the final report, much like the previous reports that I highlighted earlier in this presentation, towards the common understanding, et cetera. So that'll be kind of the main kind of conclusion or summary of the work that we've done. However, there's a lot of tools that we're planning to, and kind of resources that we're planning, or that I'm planning to kind of produce as part of this. So it's not just these transfer templates that I've been talking about, but CoSA, many of you probably know, CoSA published and promulgated an electronic records transfer checklist. Given that we have a lot of new information coming in, that can be improved and refined and made more useful and more targeted towards the right stakeholders. There's that guide, that summary and kind of articulation of those universal transfer requirements, kind of put in simple terms that both archives, but also our collaborators and our stakeholders can understand. Having that distilled down to those foundations will be really important. Then there's best practices, kind of sample workflows, procedures. These are not necessarily ones that can be taken whole cloth and inserted into one's workflow, but the idea is that here's a way that it has been done. Here's why it works. Adapt, and kind of remix as you need. Then there's mapping of these building blocks to organizational maturity. That's really important because we know that every state, again, different amount of funding, different size of their archives, different number of staff, different amounts of experience. There is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, but what I'm hoping to be able to do is say, okay, what can you do tomorrow if you are at this level of organizational maturity? And many of the states have self-reported organizational maturity. I'm not judging anyone. It's just, where you think you are, what can you do? Because I think one of the pitfalls of these types of projects in the past has been, here's what you should be doing. It's a laundry list of 30 different things, and you don't even have a computer yet, right? So if you're at the early stages of developing a digital preservation program and haven't done any transfers yet, what can you do? If you're more advanced, what can you in that position? And if you're really advanced and you're taking transfers all the time, where can you improve as well? Because we can all improve. And then I leave it up to the focus group. Part of the advantage of having all these great minds in one place and us kind of talking about this is that I don't know what we're all going to come up with. I am formally a digital archivist at a state, but I'm not working for one right now. I work with CoSA. So while I have a pretty good idea of what states are doing, the focus group members are in the front lines, in the trenches, whatever euphemism you want to use. They're working on this stuff right now. They'll be able to tell me right away, this isn't going to work for us, or this is not realistic because X, Y, and Z. So what the focus group members actually need, that's really important as well, because I don't want to give you something you don't need. And then, like I said, this is all going to be due toward the end of 2020, January 2021. So I'm sure you'll be, you will know that it's coming, and I'll probably be doing another one of these presentations with all the conclusions and highlighting all the resources that we've created. So that's really the project. That's kind of where we are now. I put some resources in here. I know that the slides are, they'll be available on the CoSA website at some point. If you search under if you search for either MoveIt and CoSA or you navigate around their website, you'll be able to find that there's a landing page for this project where I'm going to put all of my resources. If you're looking for more information about Toward a Common Understanding, it's a really good resource to start with. That kind of underscores a lot of the problem statement that really led to the genesis of this project. And then obviously the SERI, CoSA, if you want to interact with the Preservica AVP, if you want to contact me, I'm available. So I'd love to hear from you either now or, over email or, through one of the other ways to reach me. I'm just happy to hear what your ideas are because, again, like I've said multiple times, this project isn't perfect either. We can always improve and refine it. So feedback is really welcome at all times. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them for the next few minutes. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nick. I am just kind of blown away. I especially love what you said, like tech comes and goes, but understanding the process makes something successful. And I feel like I need to needle point that on a pillow and keep it in my office.
Yeah.
So everyone, we do have time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes until 4, but Nick, I don't know what your schedule's like. If you could stay a little past 4, we need to cut it off right at 4, but we'll try to make time for plenty of questions. If you do have a question, please type it into the chat box. Make sure it's addressed to everyone so that we can all see it, and we will read it out so that it's caught on the recording. So I do have a question, Nick, while we wait on questions to come in. I think maybe the guide you talked about fits this most, but I'm wondering if one of the deliverables will be geared towards not the elevator speech, but some sort of guide for how to get stakeholders on board in this process.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think one of the biggest gaps and again, I refer to the Toward a Common Understanding document as well for really some good data that was gathered in this was the fact that it's hard to foster a collaboration without having everyone have those same expectations, right? So I think for a long time, certainly records management community and certainly archives community as well, we've been kind of espousing that records management is good for business, right? You save money, you save time, you get more efficient, fewer kind of lawyers that need to review stuff, fewer embarrassing situations of law breaking when you accidentally destroy records that you need to keep. So I think that has been said kind of ad infinitum. However, one of the things that I think we can really underscore here is that it's expensive to extract data from proprietary systems. Like I said, many of us have been in situations, and I can really speak from my own kind of anecdotal experience, that nothing is more frustrating as an archivist when you're working with a public agency and they say, oh, we can't get our data out of the system because the vendor wants $50,000 to do that. That is a very real scenario that I'm sure that has happened to every one of us in some way or in some form or another. And that's not a problem with the vendor. That's a problem with all of the stakeholders on our side. So on the government side of things, this is a public agency, this is the IT, and this is archives. Us not thinking ahead. When we signed that contract 20 years ago, we didn't think, oh, what are we going to do when it's time to get the data out? We didn't actually think about migrating the data out. So certainly, that's one of the major things that we need to be talking about, how to actually deal with contractors, deal with vendors, and really be able to make those points very clear and really succinctly in a way that they understand, because everybody understands money, and money is, it's in short supply when it comes to government, and certainly when it comes to public archives. So being able to say, yeah, it's really going to cost you not very long from now, or you're going to end up having to break the law, or worse is that you're going to just end up sitting with this data that is going to be it's a national risk, but it's also kind of a local risk for you as well.
Right. I can see that being a good pitch to the much higher ups in administration, but also to the IT department or, your IT agency, because they don't want to have to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We do have a question from Lori at Preservica. Nick, were there IT people involved in the interviews, agency staff, or were the interviews with state archive staff only? So I think when when you must have talked to the State Archive staff on your focus group for those interviews.
Yep. So there were IT folks. In fact, we had an IT professional in the focus group from the state of Maryland. So thank you to him certainly. And I didn't necessarily talk to any agency staff directly, but I know that as part of this process, I know that the focus group members, where necessary, went back to and consulted with their IT staff and their records creators just to kind of clarify some points, gather some more information. So it may not have been a direct, they weren't directly in the interviews necessarily, with one exception, but they certainly were consulted. So, those perspectives, kind of what they were thinking, what they were trying to focus on, what was going on, that was certainly captured. And in a couple of the cases for the actual exemplars, it's going to be very important to telling the story, what was actually happening in statewide IT, what was actually happening at the agency, because those things which are not really in the control of the archives, if you are like I said, if you're an elected official and whoops, you lost your re-election campaign, it's time to scramble, that actually really heavily impacts what the consequences of how this electronic records transfer is going to look. If you have 3 months to prepare versus 2 years to prepare. So those factors are very real. So we did try to collect and capture those as much as possible. So I hope that answers your question in my location's way of doing so.
Lori, let us know if that didn't quite. Okay. Sounds like it did cover the question. And I think I should take the opportunity, too, to not only thank you, Nick, but to thank the members of the focus group that are on the call, because it sounds like it was a really fruitful collaboration. I do know some of those folks, so thank you to them as well for making all of this possible.
Oh, yeah, I would say certainly from me, the members of the focus group, our sponsors, Council of State Archivists, the consultants and the staff that work there, everyone has been hugely supportive, and this has been one big collaborative project. And while I might be steering it, I'm not necessarily doing all of the work or even most of the work. That really is that intellectual work is coming from everybody, and that's important because I don't know everything about archival or digital preservation practice in the United States, and nobody does. But we all of us together, we do. So that's kind of where we were going with this.
Certainly. All right, we have another question from Lori. Anything that you've learned that suggests something to add to the biannual State of the State record survey that Veronica is working on?
Yes, but I haven't figured out exactly how to articulate it. One of the major issues that I've kind of talked about a lot during this presentation is not just this collaboration with our stakeholders, and especially with the records custodians themselves, so public agencies, but also understanding what their expectations are, why they have those expectations, and how they're hoping to fulfill those expectations, right? Because I think that when the conversation begins, the records are eligible for retention or service full or whatever, we need to transfer stuff to you. The number of times I've been in the room having that conversation and I say, okay, well, here are the X, Y, and Z, the 20 different things we need to deal with. And kind of the blank stare that comes. So, essentially what I'm getting at is how do we evaluate kind of the readiness and the understanding and the maturity of our public agencies to be able to say, are they actually ready to transfer the records, and do they have a desire to? I'm not really sure how to ask the archives to evaluate that of their own states, but I theorize that certainly the focus group members have a good idea of who they're working with. Everybody, we know who we've worked with before. We know who we have trouble with, who there's difficult situations, and the worst transfers, again, anecdotally that we've talked about, always are ones where the agency didn't want to collaborate, they didn't want to put any time into it, they didn't really understand what their expectations were. And the converse is true as well. The best ones are where all of those different factors were in lockstep. So I don't really know if that helps, but that is one thing that I think that CoSA and SERI need to be doing more of. It's not just kind of broadcasting to public agencies, but also hearing from them as well. What are their expectations, and how can we better kind of facilitate those collaborations between state agencies and the archives in a way that's not intrusive, of course, right? Like, Nobody
Sure.
wants to hear from CoSA and be like, hey, archives, do you know about this stuff? Why are they bothering us, right? It's kind of, it's a way to say, we are here to help. If you want our help, how can we help? Those kinds of things.
Right. We have a question from Tyler in Pennsylvania. Nick, when you learned about the various states' workflows being used to transfer electronic records, were there any surprises that came up, or at least something you didn't expect to learn there?
So I'm kind of jaded as a human. I wouldn't say that I was surprised by anything. Actually, I think the thing that was surprising, that was most surprising was the level of maturity that some of the states had. And there's kind of and the way I want to say this is that I think there is a belief with a select few who I will exempt with. I think we all feel in a way that we're like, I could be doing this a lot better, but this is what I have to do, right? It's like I'm doing what is pragmatically possible, but you know, it might not be what you're looking for. Pretty much everybody at some point said, I don't know, this project probably isn't good enough for this one, you know, but they're all great projects, you know, and the truth is we're not looking for perfection. Nobody has perfection. But when it comes to actual process, I did think that there would be a little bit more kind of standardization to it. But again, I think that highlights the fact that the requirements and the expectations in every state are very, very different. And one thing that, you know, is, and this is why CoSA is in kind of a difficult position a lot, is that I don't know what the political climate is in Texas versus California versus New York versus Vermont versus Idaho versus Alaska versus Guam or whatever. You know, I don't. All of those situations are different, not only from a how does the archive function, but also how does government function, right? What is the model of government? How does everybody work together? Some places it's you know it's really close, and other places it's, you know, they couldn't be more different. They might be, you know, the left hand versus the right hand versus two different people on different sides of the room in terms of how distant we are. The other thing that I was really surprised to learn was that just kind of, you know, the variety there is in statewide records retention and digital preservation requirements. Now, every state basically has some, but the way that it's implemented, who is responsible, who is accountable, is very different in every place. And I thought that would be a big hurdle, but the truth is, I don't think it is anymore, because I really do feel a lot of what we're talking about is more universal than the vagary of changing law or changing technology, you know. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think it'll all come out. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for participating in the focus group, Taylor.
Right, so we're a little past 4 right now, and I don't know if anyone has any more questions. I'll wait just a minute to give everyone Nick, is this a question you can answer quickly? Because I'm curious. I know one of the initial things that started this off was that there are outdated records retention schedules governing a lot of these things. Is one of the possible inclusions in the deliverable suggestions for how to update those records retention schedules to bring things into the future?
I hadn't really thought too much about that, and let me clarify what I mean when I say that records retention schedules are outdated. It's not that the legal requirements have necessarily changed. You know, a lot of records retention schedules or similar instruments can be dated from the 1950s or earlier. You know, there are some in federal government that, you know, there's a single statute that says this is going to be preserved for this long, right? Like, those things tend to not change. However, you know, when a record schedule is written, one thing that you need to really be thinking about is what is the technological infrastructure in place, what is the procedural infrastructure. And while I'm not saying that the record schedule is going to be changed because of that, if you write a schedule that cannot be executed, have you succeeded? Right? And so
Right.
You know, part of the problem is that the way that some record schedules exist, and I'm not a national expert on how record schedules and disposition or records retention, how those things are drafted. I know a lot about what we did in Vermont, and I know some about some of the other states, and, you know, a decent amount about the federal government, but everybody does it a little bit differently. Everybody articulates what needs to be done a little bit differently, and, you know, and everybody has different models for doing those type of things. But I think it's more of a when you think about legal requirements, you know, there's always two aspects to it. There is this is what you must do, right? That's kind of what the statute says. And then there's the regulation, which tends to say more of this is how you need to do it, right? This is what you must do. This is how you comply with the statutory intent. And I think that there is a whole lot of records retention that is based on what you must do, and not enough that is based that focuses on how you should do it. And I'm not saying that that has to be built into record schedules, but that needs to be somewhere. That's what we need more of, because, and this is just from my experience as well. You could put a record schedule in front of somebody who who thinks that who might even be a records information management professional, and doesn't guarantee that they're going to understand it, doesn't guarantee that they're going to be able to understand the formatting or the way things are articulated or how it works. And there's no amount of, you can't make a record schedule perfect as well. It's about kind of trying to figure out how to do it as much. So.
Right.
So no, in short, I would say kind of no. Like I don't know if I could make recommendations, because everybody does their records retention differently and their scheduling differently. However, I think there are some universal ways to say, here are some ways to comply with your requirements, right? When people, this is what it might mean. And then again, I think the best approach is for us to come up with a kind of universal fundamental document and say, here you go, state archives or state records management, adapt this. You know your state better than we ever could, so you make it your own. Change it, remix it, fix it, whatever. That's what we're here for. So I think that's the goal.
Okay. Well, it's 6 minutes past 4, and I don't see any more questions in the chat box. So, Becky, if you could go ahead and thank you, presenter capabilities back, I will close this out. Thank you so much, Nick, for presenting today. It's very, very informative for me, and it sounds like for everyone else as well. And thank you for everyone that attended, and thank you again to those focus group members that are on the call, and those that might be listening later. When you close out of the webinar, you will automatically be taken to an online webinar evaluation. Please fill it out. It does help us to plan future webinars. And if there are topics that you would like to see covered in the future, please let us know. We are always looking for those opportunities. Please stay connected. You can visit the CoSA website, www.statearchivist.org. Visit us on Twitter @statearchivist and the CoSA webpage. And we look forward to connecting with everyone in the future. Thank you so much for logging on, and we'll see everyone in September.